Yeah. Well, what was it? Let's see.
It was something
Oh
about
yeah, it was about
Kabbalah.
Yes, well, yes, I hope so. It was having, how does Kabbalah relate to mitzvah?
Right.
Yeah, and well, you get the
Right.
gist. That's about
So,
it.
well, in some way, it's right. It's a perfect question for today's class in some way. So we'll at least begin and we'll get a perspective on the Baal Shem Tov's answer to that question. And it turns out to be important in general in terms of understanding what the Baal Shem Tov was about and what he's doing. So it's a good question. Okay, should we rock?
Let's rock.
Let's rock.
Are we going to read for like we had the book last time? Are we going to read something for this?
Yes. Well, I can't make you read, but I can point you to a book. Whether we read or not, it's sort of up to you. But yeah, I'm going to recommend. We're going to use a text that I'll share with you, and I probably should have gotten it to you earlier because you might not get it in time. You don't need it for today. 1 second, let people are still coming in here. Oh,
probably going to be on sale for Amazon Prime Day.
Say it again.
I said it'll probably be on sale for Amazon Prime Day.
Yeah,
it's
huge
joke for the day.
Huge seller, Baal Shem Tov. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to give a little bit of like boring background. I'm not going to try to make it boring, but my point is we're not going to dive into the texts right away. We'll try to spend most of our time on texts in this class. In fact, almost all of our time on texts in this class. But I want you to have a background about the Baal Shem Tov and about who he was. David Stern is here, so I have the opportunity to thank David Stern for giving me this book. He gave me this book which weighs more than, I mean, this book is so heavy that there are other smaller books orbiting around it because its gravitational force is so mighty. So thank you, David Stern, for giving me this extra copy. And it is excellent. It is written with such clarity and lucidity, and it's really fantastic. So it's about Hasidism. So I'm drawing on some of the material there, and I just want to give you a background so you have a sense of the soil out of which the Baal Shem Tov's work grew. And then we'll dive into a few texts. So that's what's going to happen for today. But let me tell you, let me just back up and tell you in general what my goal is in this class. So as we've been talking about, probably everybody here has had some kind of encounter with Hasidic teachings. But the way that we usually encounter those is like a little bit here, a little bit there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in general, I've tried to give you as exposure, not just in this class, but through the congregation. I try to give people exposure to as many different dimensions of the tradition as possible. But it's also really nice to do a deep dive on a single teacher, and so we just spent roughly a year, for those who were in the whole class, or more than a year, on Sha'arei Ora, on the Gates of Light book by Chikatilia. And rather than just do a couple of sessions on the Baal Shem Tov and move on to other Hasidic teachers, I thought it would be really, really nice to do a really deep dive. So honestly, I don't know when this class ends. I mean, I know when it ends today. It'll be about the same length of Sha'arei Ora, but I mean, we're just going to keep going until we have a really good sense of what the Baal Shem Tov did. And I want to do that in general, just because that's a good thing to do with anybody we're reading, whether it's the Kedushat Levi or whether it's Rashi or anybody, but also in particular, the Baal Shem Tov is such an enormously important figure in the history of Judaism, but also in particular for how Judaism plays out today, the things that interest contemporary Jews. You may have heard the phrase neo-Hasidism, but even if you haven't, if you have sat in any congregation and you've heard the rabbi talking about, cleaving to God or trying to see God's presence in the universe, or using Jewish meditation, or a rabbi talking about Kabbalah. That's because of the Baal Shem Tov. He obviously did not invent Kabbalah, but the proliferation of Kabbalah in Jewish life, it's the way that it's used to engage the Jewish laity in daily life and in understanding their lives as Jews. That's because of the Baal Shem Tov. So we can't really overstate his importance. He's just a giant figure. And so that's why it's particularly worthwhile to spend a lot of time understanding him, because in understanding him, we're understanding the roots of this tree that began to grow in the 17th and 18th centuries that still continues to provide fruit for Jewish life today all over the world. So, okay, so let's jump in. I'm just going to start with some background. I'm going to try to do this pretty quickly because I really want to spend most of our time in the texts. But before we get to the Baal Shem Tov himself, we have to understand a little bit about the Jewish world that he came out of. And the 17th century was, so we're talking about Poland now. And actually, you know what, let's do this. Let me start you off with a little, look at this technology, hold on. Okay, so this is really where the Baal Shem Tov, it's not actually where he was born. He was born a couple hours drive from here, although he didn't have access to a car, so it would have been a longer journey. But he may have been born in a place called Toulouse. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. But he was really known for the work that he began to do at this place called Mezbij. So if we zoom in a little bit, just to give you a sense of the lay of the land, of course, this, whoopsie, wrong direction. Of course, this is a distorted regional picture because this is a modern map. And, you know, obviously the boundaries have changed a lot, but we're talking about what we now say is Eastern Europe, but at one time was part of the Polish kingdom. So if we keep going in, you'll see that there's actually still somewhere here, there's a shul with the Baal Shem Tov's name on it. Now I can't find it, but that's okay. It's not the Church of St. John the Divine. But in any event, that just to locate where we are in the world. We're looking at Poland, and we're looking in the 17th century. And the Jewish life in this era was complicated because in the 17th century, there was really some brutal time for Jews. But it was also, by the time of the birth of the Baal Shem Tov, there had been relative stability for Jews. It was a relatively good time. And I say relative because with the threat of pogroms kind of, in the past and massacres of Jews in the past, and the constant presence of anti-Semitism, there's always this sense among the Jewish community that they're waiting for the other shoe to drop. So I don't want to say that it was a time of total stability, but we in order to understand Jewish history, we do have to get our heads out of the notion that there was this unceasing brutality from the year 70 through 1945, right? That just does not tell the whole story of Jewish life in any part of the world. And so this was a time of relative stability. And in very recent memory, some really bad stuff that had happened to Jews. In addition to that, there had been in the very recent past this Sabbatean movement, this movement across Europe where this person who's known now as Shabtai Tzvi had presented himself as the Mashiach, as the Messiah to Jews in Europe and part of the Ottoman Empire. And I don't think we have any really way to understand what this would have been like, but Jews across all of Europe were swept up in this notion that they were living during the time of the Messiah. And then Shabbatai Tzvi, about whom I don't know very much, but quite a lot has been written. He then converts to Islam, which is a pretty good sign that he's not the Mashiach, for those who are paying close attention. And this is just an earth-shattering trauma in the life of the Jewish people within Europe. Both among those who had believed that he was Mashiach and that they were, whether they knew him or not or had heard him or not, the sense that there was this, that Jews were on the cusp of some grand change in history, or whether they always thought this guy was a fraud. But the fact that he's now converted to Islam just creates this little bit of a social crisis within Jewish cultural life and Jewish religious life. And so there has been in recent memory this groundswell of excitement and religious fervor that has now, and that bubble has kind of now burst. And that also happens not too long before the birth of the Besht. Okay, so then the other thing that you need to know that's happening, and there aren't clear dates for what I'm about to talk about, but there had been in the late Middle Ages, there had been among European Jews, there had been what the authors of this book call small h Hasidism. So, and it's I forgot what the historical phrase I learned in rabbinical school. I think it was like the Hasidei Ashkenaz. So that is to say, a really strong religious pietist movement. Okay, this precedes the Baal Shem Tov, a pietist movement that was deeply based in Kabbalah, and it was also very strongly influenced by certain ascetic practices. So, and in some of the visions that we have of medieval Christians who are like wandering ascetics, well, the truth is that was also in parts of the Jewish world. Now, just as now, back then, the Jewish world was really complicated. So when I say that there was a pietistic movement of mystics and ascetics, I don't mean that all Jews did that. But there were such Jews, and sometimes, very often, they held themselves apart from the rest of the Jewish community because they felt like the average Jew was not learned enough in Kabbalah to hang out with them, and also was not committed enough to really to live a life of asceticism. But there was a movement of Kabbalistic and also ascetic Judaism that swept through parts of Eastern Europe. So that's also important for understanding the power of the Baal Shem Tov. And also that, Kabbalah was not widely studied by the average Jew, but the average Jew was aware that there were important teachers among them who studied Kabbalah. Okay? Now, one of the offshoots of the Kabbalistic movement of this period was what we now call practical Kabbalah. And practical Kabbalah has nothing to do with the book that I probably have recommended to some of you, which is called Practical Kabbalah, which is, by the way, footnote here, a really interesting book written by a rabbi named Label Wolf, who tries to give one a sense of how to integrate Kabbalistic practices into prayer and stuff. But historically speaking, practical Kabbalah has to do with the working of magic, and in particular, the use of Kabbalistic practices for healing, right? So, back in the day, they didn't have Kaiser, and they didn't have HMOs, and they didn't have healthcare through work, and healthcare was the practice of medicine was, shall we say, just beginning to be a self-conscious practice and still developing. And part of the medical, what we would now say part of the medical world was, at least in the Jewish world, was I guess faith healing. And there were certain Kabbalistic practitioners who would go around and they would help people. And sometimes that was just helping people with an illness, an individual who had an illness. Other times it was helping people, what we would now call like an exorcism, somebody who had been possessed by demons, or it could be Kabbalists who would come in and they would protect a village that had been under threat because of, Cossacks or whatever, or some other threat. So these people who engaged in practical Kabbalah, and incantations and different formulas and putting together certain roots and different, wood shavings, and you would pulverize wood and say a certain blessing over it. These people were called Baal Shem, that is Baal Shem. Okay, so and Baal Shem means the master of the name. So when I say the name, what do you think the name is? Right, I see some of you mouthing it, but your mics are off. Yeah, the name of God. And the way that it would work is that you would take the name of, there were certain letters that could be pronounced, different combinations of the 4-letter name of God that within classical Kabbalah is already an important spiritual practice, being able to know how to combine different aspects of the divine name. But these Baal Shem, the masters of the name, were people who were said to have certain abilities for healing or quote unquote magic by understanding how to relate to the name. So the Baal Shem Tov was one of those Baal Shem. He was a Baal Shem. And there were many of them. And in some ways, he was initially totally unremarkable. He did what all of them did. They traveled around. Some of them would be invited by a community to reside within the community and work on behalf of the community. And that's what eventually brought the Baal Shem to the town where he would spend most of her life. Okay, I see a hand. Let me pause here. I think there are a couple of questions I saw. Cheryl, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the time frame in my head. So the small H Hasidim, my question is around when were they? And the small H Hasidim, were they Baal Shem?
Great question. So what the historians call Hasidei Ashkenaz, like the Hasidim of Europe, it's a medieval movement that goes back to probably the 11th century or something. Okay. So it had been going on for some time, and it probably has its own shapes and contours and development. Okay. But
and way before Baal Shem Tov.
Yeah, way before Baal Shem Tov. As to the relationship between those guys and the Baal Shem, I don't know. I don't know if it's part of the same group or a distinct movement. I think they're probably related. In other words, Baal Shem were probably part of that larger movement. Okay, so in the year 1699, there is born a Jew named Yisrael ben Eliezer. Yisrael ben Eliezer. Totally unremarkable Jewish name for somebody who would eventually become a world-changing, remarkable Jew. And eventually, this person becomes a Baal Shem. Is one of many, 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 many Baal Shem. He eventually in 1740, so when he's 40 or 41 or 42, he moves to that town that I showed you on our little map here. One second. He moves to Medjugorje in what is now Ukraine. And he takes up with the congregation there, and the community, I should say with the community, not with the congregation. And the community supports him. The community supports him, and he kind of lives there. And it would have been a pretty big community, so he must have had a pretty good name for himself, and must have already developed some kind of ability and reputation as a healer. and because it was a significant enough size of a community that it really stood out. So again, it wasn't like some singular reputation that he had developed, but he must have been doing something right, because this somewhat large community, relatively large community, or mid-sized community, I should say, takes him on and gives him a stipend. So the next thing that I want to say, and then we'll get into the texts here pretty quickly, is the circle of the Besht. Eventually, well, sorry, let me say it like this. So eventually the Baal Shem Tov starts teaching in a different way, and he starts teaching a different kind of content, a different material, which we'll talk about briefly. But we don't actually have any books from the Besht. And sorry, let me say one thing about that phrase, the Besht. The Besht is an abbreviation for Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. He becomes associated with this title, and Besht is the abbreviation. So when I say Besht, I'm talking about Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov, the Besht doesn't actually author any books. And so it's quite interesting that during the course of his life, his influence, if you measure it by numbers of people, was quite small, was quite limited. He had a small circle of people around him, probably, 7, 8, 9 people who were very close to him and understood immediately that this person brought a new kind of power to Torah that had not been seen before. But it's not like during his lifetime, it's not like he was filling stadiums with people who wanted to come hear him teach. And so what we know of his work actually, what we know of his teaching actually comes to us through some of the most important members of that circle. So I'll just name a couple of them. These are not necessarily names you need to know, but I just want you to be aware that when we're studying the Baal Shem Tov's work, we're actually studying the words, not of the Baal Shem Tov, but of his initial students. So a couple of those are Yaakov Yosef of Plonia, who wrote a famous work called Toldot Yaakov Yosef. Another one named Pinchas of Koretz, and one who you maybe have heard of, more likely to have heard of, Dov Ber ben Avraham, who becomes known as the Magid of Mezrich, the Magid, the preacher or the storyteller or the teacher of Mezrich. So the Magid is Dov Ber, and Dov Ber and Yaakov Yosef of Plonia become really the two people who are, I think, most responsible for creating the school of thought that we now say was the school of thought of the Baal Shem Tov, because they are the ones who take his ideas and they articulate them and they spread them around. So, yeah, so for example, and then we'll dive right in, I promise, right after this. So this is, just to give you an example of this. So I'm holding here this book that says, what does it say? That just says Baal Shem Tov al HaTorah, right? The teachings of the Baal Shem Tov on the Torah. And when you open it somewhat randomly, every single one of these teachings has attributed to it down here the source from which it came. And none of them say Baal Shem Tov. They all say the name of the teacher, whether it's the Magid or whether it's Pinchas of Koretz. But so all of our teachings from the Baal Shem Tov actually come from this circle. Eventually, this circle grows, and those teachers have students, and those students have students, and those students have students. And that pool of teachings from all of these people who started learning with the Baal Shem Tov is what we call Hasidism. When we study Hasidut, we are looking at a leaf on a branch of a tree that was planted by the Baal Shem Tov. by Israel ben Eliezer. Okay, so that's where we are. So we are in this class going to stick as close to the first generation as we can. We're going to be mostly, at least initially, looking at the works of the Maggid and of the Toldot Yaakov Yosef. Okay, and again, you don't have to remember those names, but I'm just making you aware of that. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to give you a minute to read a story, and then we're going to talk about it. But first, let me share my screen. Okay, so this appears in a book called the Keter Shem Tov, which is a collection of the teachings of the Baal Shem. And I'm going to give you a minute to read this story, okay?
Can you make it a little bigger, please, Rabbi?
Yeah, is it hard to see? On my screen, it's ginormous, so.
I have old lady eyes.
Okay, is that better?
That's
Where is this in Safari, so I can just look at it?
Oh,
myself?
it's Keter Shem Tov to, I mean, yeah, you could, that's the citation I have. I mean, I can do this. Hold on one second. I can copy the link and give it to you. Give me a sec.
A great idea, Lenny.
Hold on, sorry. I'm
Always thinking.
always thinking. Okay, here is the text. I'm sending this to everybody. I'm not even sure. I don't know that it's translated there. I just realized this is my translation that I have not yet shared. I may not have yet shared with the Safaria community.
It's
so,
not.
huh?
It's not.
Yeah, sorry. This is my translation. I will add it to the Safaria translations, but this is my own. So if people, I'll tell you what, if people are having trouble reading it, then I'll read it, okay? I heard from a certain Chassid who heard from Rav Dov Ber, okay, again, that's the Maggid, about the great name of the holy rabbi, the Baal Shem Tov. All the people would travel to him, right? So the he started to gain a reputation, and the Baal Shem Tov would travel, people would travel to the Baal Shem, and he would accomplish awesome and great things through his prayer. The Maggid Rav Dov Ber was extraordinarily fluent and knowledgeable in all of Shas, and in every verse, he had 10 rungs of Kabbalistic knowledge. And he was completely puzzled by what he was hearing about the greatness of the Besht, because this is before the Maggid knew the Besht. So the Maggid himself, and this is important to understand because this is part of what I'm trying to teach you about the Baal Shem Tov, it's not like other Jews in Poland were ignorant, right? I mean, the Dov Ber was this incredible Kabbalist. He had like 10 levels of Kabbalistic understanding of every verse in the Torah, according to this origin story. And he was fluent in Gemara, okay? This guy, he's no chump. And he hears these crazy stories about this guy named Baal Shem Tov, and he works magic and he does amazing things. And he's like, who is this dude, right? So that's the kind of background. Okay. One time he thought he would travel to the Besht in order to test him. So he wants to go and be like, I'm just going to overturn this guy. He's some nobody rabbi. You know, he's probably charismatic, and I'm just going to like throw down some knowledge and embarrass him. Maybe that's what he has in mind. Now, the Maggid Dov was the person who studied constantly, but on account of the journey for a couple of days, he was unable to study as he would at home. So he started to regret making the journey. Finally, he came to the Besht and he wanted to learn Torah from him. In other words, he says to the Besht, so yo, teach me some Torah. The Besht told him a story about how he traveled once on a journey of several days, and he didn't have enough bread to give to the non-Jew who was his cart driver. So he, that is the Baal Shem Tov, found some other poor non-Jew who had a bit of bread, and he bought it from him so he could feed the cart driver. And he told him other stories like this. On the second day, he came again to the Besht, and this time he told him how that once on a journey he didn't have enough feed for the horses and he had to arrange for it, etc., etc. Now, now this is the author of the story kind of interpolating here. One with the one second here. One with the ability to understand all these tales that the Besh told him would see that they contained wondrous and abundant spiritual wisdom. But the Magi Dov Ber did not understand. Okay, so let me pause here. So you have this great Kabbalist and this great student of Gemara, and he goes to this person who's gained this incredible reputation, this charismatic leader, and he travels to him and he says, teach me some Torah. And the guy tells him a couple of stupid stories about, one time I didn't have enough bread for my cart driver and I got some. And another time I didn't have enough feed for my horses and I got some. And the Dove Bear is not impressed. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so that's the background. Keep going. So he went to the guest house, that is the guest house where he, the Maggid, was staying, and he said to his assistant, I want to travel back home as soon as we can. It's so dark though now. Let's stay here until the light of the moon rises, and then we will go on our way. So let me pause here for a moment. So before we go further in the story, does anybody, when he says when he refers to the light of the moon, does anybody remember, any Kabbalists among you remember what that might signify in this story? It's a somewhat obscure point. So this would be going way back for those who were in the book of the Gates of Light Chikatilia class when we studied Malchut. The moon is one of the names for Malchut. Or so I should say one of the symbols of Malchut. So that is to say that the moon represents a full moon, a moon that is blazing with light, represents like the full channeling of the blessing of Shekhinah, of God's presence in the world. Okay. So, it's not my point here to overanalyze this particular story, but the author of this origin story is not just telling you that it was dark and he wanted to wait for it to be light. He's telling you something about spiritual awakening. So anyway, so let's wait till the light of the moon rises, until like the moon moves up in the sky, and then we'll be able to see. So, and then we'll go on our way. So he wants to get out of here because he's already concluded the Besh is just a nobody. So at midnight, as the Maggid was preparing to travel, the Besh sent his assistant to call for him. So he goes to the Besh, and the Besh asked him, are you learned? And he responded, yes. Now, I want to just say one brief thing about this phrase, are you learned? It actually is when I was first translating this, I didn't really think about how important this phrase was, and I translated it idiomatically, but I want to belabor it here because it's actually really, I think, very, very important to the story. So let me just highlight, and then I'll explain. Let me highlight what he actually says to him. Okay, so what he actually says to him, I know which is which here. He actually says to him, Yachol lilmod, which really means, are you able to learn? So I translated that idiomatically as, are you learned? But we'll come back to that phrase, are you able to learn? But apparently the Dove Bear knew what he meant idiomatically, and he said, yes. The Besh said, indeed, I've heard that you are quite learned. So the Besh asked him, do you know about the spiritual wisdom of Kabbalah? And the Dove Bear said, yes, I do. The Besh said to his assistant, bring me Sefer Eitz Chaim. Now, Sefer Eitz Chaim is a very, very important book of Kabbalah, and this is another reason I chose this story, is that I want you to have an understanding. It'll give you an understanding of the Besh's place if you understand Sefer Eitz Chaim. Sefer Eitz Chaim is the kind of masterwork of the collection of the teachings of the Ari, of Isaac Luria. So the Eitz Chaim is like the book of Kabbalah that begins to spread starting in the I forgot what century, but a hundred years plus before this Baal Shem Tov, it starts to spread all around the world as this like Kabbalistic rejuvenation. But Sefer Eitz Chaim is extraordinarily difficult to understand. It's baffling almost beyond explanation. And so people have dedicated their lives to trying to understand the Eitz Chaim, which purports to be an explanation of the Kabbalah, but it is in itself, even though it's sort of like, I read once the book by who's like the great physicist of our time, the fellow who's confined to a wheelchair.
Steve.
What's his name?
Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking, right. Stephen Hawking once came out with a book that was purported to be like an explanation of his physics for the layperson. And I read that book like 4 times and I had no idea what it said. So the Sefer Eitz Chaim is kind of like that. It was supposed to be a systematic explanation. It is a systematic explanation of the Kabbalah, but it is in itself extremely difficult. And that's why Kabbalah was really at this point for an elite audience. Okay, so let's go back to the text. Do you know about the spiritual wisdom of the Kabbalah? And he said, yes. So the Besh says to his assistant, bring me Sefer Eitz Chaim. And the Besh pointed the Rav Magid Dov Ber to a certain passage in Sefer Eitz Chaim. The Magid said to him, okay, great, I'll take it and give me a minute to sit and study. So the Besh gives him the text and he points him to a particular passage and he says, teach this to me. And the Magid says, okay, great, give me a minute. He sits down. Afterwards, Dov Ber explained the pshat, that is the plain meaning of the passage. The Besh said to him, you don't know anything. So he looked at it again and he said to the Besh, the pshat as I said it is correct. If you know another pshat, if you know another explanation of the basic meaning, tell me and we'll compare the two and I'll tell you whether you have it right, Besh, or whether I have it right. The Besh said, stand on your feet. And so he stood. And within this passage of Sefer Eitz Chaim were the names of many angels. Immediately when the Besh explained the passage, the entire house was filled with light and fire rose up around them. They actually saw these angels. And he said to the Magid Dov Ber, the Peshat was indeed as you said, but your learning was without your whole being. And you didn't bring your soul to your learning. Immediately, the Magid Dov Ber instructed his assistant to go back home, and he stayed there with the Besh, and he learned with him great and profound spiritual wisdom. All of this I heard from the holy mouth of the Rav, the Magid himself, Dov Ber, may his memory be a blessing. Okay, so let me get your reactions to that story, visceral, intellectual, interrogative, whatever they might be. What are your reactions? Anne?
My first reaction is that the Magid traveled a long way to learn from the Besht, and his first inclination was to go home again, to say, I gave this guy 2 chances and he's talking nonsense, so I need to go home. And he needs to have this dramatic miracle in front of him before he's willing to.
Interesting.
Learning.
Right. It can't just be, it wasn't just going to be like he heard the Baal Shem Tov preach and he was like, yeah, he's actually pretty good, I'm going to hang out for a while. It was this like massive, unmistakably miraculous transformation. Yeah. Other reactions? Cheryl?
I'm thinking about when the Magid first gets to the Baal Shem Tov and he hears these, what sound to him like really trivial stories. So what was in those stories that he missed?
Right. Yeah, I actually didn't really reflect on those stories, but I do wonder whether they are explained elsewhere.
I kind of wonder if they were the Besht referring to the fact that, because it comes right after he didn't have time to study on the road,
Right.
I wonder if it's the best knowing that and saying, you know, I didn't have food for the horses, but I managed to find it, and I didn't have this, but I
Oh,
find it, and you could have found time to study too.
oh, interesting. That's great. That's great. That's really fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the other thing is that the other interesting thing, and I hadn't thought, I wasn't intending on going down this path. For what it's worth, both of those stories are not about the Besht sustaining himself. They're about how he sustains other people, right? And so another possible message from those stories is all you care about is your own learning. Like, what's that about? You went on a journey and you only care about that you're losing out on your own learning, and you're not interested in sustaining others. So who knows? That could be another thing. Lenny.
There's a lot of Hasidic stories where, you know, somebody goes to see the rabbi. Now I know where Bob Dylan got his song. I went, go on back to see the gypsy.
Right.
Anyway,
Right.
for those who are familiar with that song.
Yep.
But there's a lot of them where the rabbi says, and then I committed these great sins, and the person realized he was actually talking about him. But
Right.
I think that part of the Peshat of that story is that Peshat is not what the Baal Shem Tov was explaining. That's not
Right.
what he was about.
Yeah, that could be, and for sure, you're totally right. This is absolutely like a trope in Hasidic stories, that you go to see the master, and the story is set up in such a way that, you know, there's going to be a great fall, because there's the guy who thinks he knows what's up, and he sees this kind of simple-minded master, and then by the end you realize that it's actually the other way around. The guy who thought he was very learned and had a great reputation doesn't know anything at all. And that's another aspect of this. That's another trope of Hasidic literature.
I always wondered if there was a relationship between the term upshot and peshat.
Oh, that's actually great. There is now. There is now. I like it. Okay. So, yeah. So, but let's return to this phrase that I pointed out here. When the Baal Shem Tov says to him, Yachol lilmod, are you able to learn? Are you able to learn? And I think that what I want to emphasize this, because it's not what the Besht did was, you know, it's the Besht didn't bring prophetic insight into new material that didn't exist. It's that he knew how to learn. He took a book like the Sefer Eitz Chaim that seemed just to be abstract Kabbalistic concepts, and he knew how to learn so that they came to life. And therefore, you know, not insignificantly, he also knew how to teach. And what I really think is the essence of the story here in some ways is, and we need to, I want to belabor a little bit because I think how it's written is really important. I think it's important that the Besht says to the Maggid, he doesn't say to him, oh, no, you misunderstood the teaching. He doesn't say that your understanding of the mamar, of the passage is wrong. He says that you're not studying it with your entire neshama. You're not invested in it in a full way. And you know, maybe you're just using your mind, or you're just trying to arrange the facts, or you're doing it for the wrong reason, like you want to sound smart. Who knows what's in there? But you're not really bringing your full being to the text. And that's actually the Maggid's problem. It's not an intellectual problem. It's a problem of his neshama not being part of his learning. And it is, the word in Hebrew is neshama. He says here, I'll highlight the whole thing for those who like the Hebrew. Whoops. Yeah, so the Baal Shem Tov says, Emet, it is true. Shahapashat kamo sha'amarta. The Peshat is exactly what you said. Aval halimud shelcha haya bli neshama, but your studying is without soul. or your learning is without soul. And so that's a really important principle that certainly you recognize just from hearing other Hasidic teachings. It resonates with what you probably already know about so much Hasidut, is that it's not merely Torah study is not merely an exercise of the mind, but that in some way that's very hard to describe and even harder to do, we have to put our full being into the learning. And it's interesting because I think sometimes this is misunderstood, although for good reason. Sometimes people believe that Hasidut is about like feeling over intellect. Like, you don't really need to worry about the ideas. You just need to feel Hashem's presence. And there's a good reason that people believe that, because indeed one of the things that the Baal Shem did was he gave unlearned Jews, like the Jews who didn't have the time to sit around the Beit Midrash and the Jews who were out in the fields working, he gave them a vocabulary and he gave them honor and he gave them importance because they could serve Hashem in whatever way they could serve Hashem. But we should not conclude from that the Baal Shem did not care about ideas and that he didn't think that mental clarity and intellectual commitment were unimportant, because he did. And for sure, he was himself learned. Obviously, he couldn't have brought the book Eitz Chaim to life in the way that he did with fire and angels unless he really understood it. So he's no slouch, but he's just saying it can't just remain up here. You've got to put your entire neshama into it. Go ahead, Brad. You're on mute. There you go.
No, I'm just wondering, it seems obvious to me, but then maybe I have a different background, but there's no mention here, as you have given it to us, that prayer is involved anywhere in this process of reaching, learning with the soul, getting in touch with that,
right,
to obtain this learning.
Well,
and it seems odd to me.
Yeah, right. But keep in mind, this is one of thousands upon thousands of teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And as we will see, prayer was extraordinarily central to the religious worldview of the Baal Shem Tov. And in fact, what we're going to do next week is we're going to shift entirely into something called Amud HaTefillah. That's really where our class is going to begin, which means the pillar of prayer, which is a very long reflection of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov about prayer. So yes, in this story, he does not talk about prayer, but prayer is absolutely central to the thought of the Baal Shem. David, you got to unmute yourself. Can't hear you, brother. There you go. Whoops. One more time. There you go.
Oh, can you hear me now? Yep. All right. There's something very democratic about this, something of popular appeal. Peshat is probably the easiest level. It's the literal level. And this enables, if you will, the common person, so to speak, who is relatively uneducated, to see a depth in scripture that wouldn't otherwise be the case.
Right.
One of the attractions of Protestantism, Luther, was that by scripture alone, Christians could understand. They don't need the kinds of intellectual intermediaries.
Right.
So it's very democratic, I think, very appealing to the common person.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I would just say, I mean, there's definitely something to that. I would say there's two levels, because just hearkening back to what I said a moment ago, for sure, there was a concern and a desire to give to, like, the average Jew the ability to cleave to God and to find a new way to talk about that and to not feel like irrelevant to the larger Jewish project that would only be in the hands of the elites. That was definitely a concern of Hasidism. but it is also true that there always remained in Hasidism this, especially among a particular branch of the Kotzker branch, there was also an elitism. There was a sense that that there were higher and lower levels of dveikut, of cleaving to God. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting, so I started with a story about the Maggid that we've now spent a significant amount of time on, and his origin story, so to speak, the origin story of the Maggid and how he becomes connected to the Baal Shem Tov. What I didn't do was to share the origin story of the Tolda Yaakov Yosef, and he was part of this Kabbalistic elite that I mentioned that had already existed before the time of the Baal Shem Tov. These people who studied Kabbalah quite intensely, quite in depth, and who had no use for the masses because they just felt like the masses couldn't possibly understand. Like at best case scenario, once in a while, the peasants could understand teaching from the rabbi, but there's no way they're going to understand the Kabbalah. And he brought that elitism into the circle of the Baal Shem Tov. And as he spread the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, that branch of the tree kind of remained elitist. And you can hear in some of his teachings about the Baal Shem Tov, where he's spreading the word about the Baal Shem Tov, there is that elitism. So I would just say that it's very complicated. But yes, for sure, one of the goals of the Baal Shem Tov was to also recognize that even the unlearned could cleave, but that did to God. But that did not mean that we should strive to be unlearned, right? And I mean, it sounds silly, but I'm belaboring it because I do think that there's something in contemporary spirituality in which people believe that in order to be spiritual, you have to overcome the intellectual, which may be true, but sometimes people think that overcoming the intellectual means just sort of short-circuiting it and like turning off your brain. And, there are interpretations of Hasidism, which I think really distort that. And this, there's the story that the Baal Shem Tov found this unlearned Jew, or maybe it's a child, and the child doesn't know how to do anything, but he knows how to play the flute. You know this? And so as he plays the flute and he's thinking of God, the Baal Shem Tov says, something like, that's the highest level of tefillah that there is. And so some people have said from that, I don't need any of the texts. I just need to wander into, Forest Park and, hug a tree, and I'm cleaving to Hashem. And I think that that's a real distortion of what's at the core of Hasidism. So that's one thing. Okay. Now, I want to get to, and there's so many different texts I wanted to share. I knew going in we weren't going to be able to get to all of them. But let's do this. We're going to look at this somewhat shorter one, and I'll invite all right. So I'll give you a minute to read this. Whoopsie, what am I doing? I'll give you a minute to read this and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so this, this has nothing to do with what we were learning earlier. This is a totally different passage and it's a totally different idea. But it also tells you something important about the Baal Shem Tov and about what he was trying to do. So they start with a passage from the Proverbs, and for our purposes, it's not the verse is not that important, but he looks at the word mitzvot, all right, and he wants to understand really what this teaching is about. Is he's saying when we talk about mitzvot, we talk about them in the plural. We don't talk about mitzvah, we talk about mitzvot. for example, as in the phrase, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvot tav, it's mitzvot tav, his mitzvot, plural. And what the first answer, why do we talk about mitzvot instead of mitzvah, is because, well, because there's 613. But the Baal Shem Tov says, no. Every mitzvah is 2 mitzvot. Every mitzvah has the lower dimension, right? So for example, if I'm making Borei Pri Hagafen, the lower mitzvah is I take a cup, I pour wine in it, and then I have to say the words properly and do it in the right way, and then drink it. That's the lower mitzvah. But if I do that without the upper mitzvah, which is, why am I doing this? What does this represent? How is this connected to God? If I do it without that, I don't actually have the full mitzvah. And so when you say a blessing, every blessing begins with Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvot tav, it's plural, etc. The reason every single mitzvah refers to mitzvot, says the Baal Shem Tov, is because every mitzvah has to have that upper dimension of understanding the spiritual meaning and your spiritual intent, that when you do this thing, you're supposed to be thinking about and feeling your connection to God. Okay? So, Brad, that was the teaching I had in mind that was a tiny partial answer to your question about the role of the mitzvot in Kabbalah.
Thanks. And that was the first, that kind of thing, the levels of these acts of mitzvot was how I first started to understand Kabbalah. Right. That's how I approached it. Right. Until then, it was it just trying to do anything with it made me scream.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's an interesting challenge in Jewish life. I completely get it. I mean, I do think that there's a flip side. I think there's a flip side that there's and now we're a little bit off track, but I do think it's worth going into. And I actually think in some ways this is one of the things that the Baal Shem Tov could not have anticipated because of the world within which he grew up, and he couldn't foresee what the modern world would be like. But here's this puzzle that we have, and I'm belaboring this because I actually think this is a profound challenge for modern Jewish life. That on the one hand, if in keeping with this teaching which we just read, if a mitzvah is just a habitual practice that just seems like arbitrary, and it doesn't bring down your connection to God, and it doesn't connect you to anything transcendent beyond yourself, eventually it's going to be too heavy a burden to bear, right? And there's a teaching that says that the reason that Moses couldn't, the reason Moses smashed the tablets is because the stones became too heavy to bear without the spiritual meaning of the words. So there is a sense that if without that larger kavanah, we can't bear the mitzvot. However, and this is the part I think the Baal Shem Tov and the Kabbalists could not really foresee, although I do wonder sometimes whether one of the reasons they were concerned about Kabbalah being spread too widely is maybe some of them knew that this was a problem in the Kabbalah, that if you, on the other hand, think that what is really important is the meaning and the larger idea of cleaving to God, and you just emphasize that, then at some point you're like, well, why do I have to say the words of the blessing? Or for that matter, why do I need the wine at all? Like, if the point is really cleaving to God, can't I just do that while I'm eating a pork sandwich, or while I'm going skiing on Shabbos? And I do think that that's another challenge with contemporary Jewish spirituality, and bringing these things both. So in other words, what I think is there is a time for just saying, whether you find the mitzvah meaningful or not, whether you feel Hashem as you drink that cup of wine, shouldn't matter. Like, ideally you want that, but if you can't, you got to do the mitzvah anyway. And the Baal Shem Tov, there's no way that he could foresee this challenge that is now a challenge in contemporary Jewish life. Lenny, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, you kind of moved on, but I don't know. I'm not really clear why you draw any distinction between this story and the previous story, because they're both saying that there's two levels to everything, right? There's the pashat of
Oh,
the
nice.
mitzvah, and then there's the depth of the mitzvah.
Nice. That's actually great. So yeah, I planned it perfectly. I planned
I
these
know
two
you're amazing. And then the other thing I would just comment is that, in a way, that's how Judaism really differentiates itself from like Eastern mysticism, is that
right.
the world is as real as a spiritual. In other words, you can't leapfrog it. It's the world isn't a cartoon, or it's not some illusion or veil that's pulled over our eyes. It's something that can't be avoided.
Right. Right. That's right. And that's right. We can't just sort of be up in the realms where we're cleaving to God. We have to get there through the prati, through the specifics. I think that's right. So, but Brad, just to be really clear, I want to be abundantly clear about this. The Baal Shem Tov invents a language, and his followers invent a language for talking about these things. But of course, the Ari, the author of the Sefer Eitz Chaim, and Jikatilia, who we studied with Sherry Ora, for them, it's a given that everyone's doing the mitzvot, right? They're not talking about the mitzvot very much because that's not what their concern is. But if somebody came to them and said, "Hey, I want to study Kabbalah, but I'm just not interested in the mitzvot," they would have said, "Get as far away from me as you possibly can, because that's insanity." Right. So that was an assumption that the mitzvot were part of Kabbalah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions before we move on? Yeah, Joel, and then Cliff.
So is it just that the Baal Shem Tov just kind of presumed or kind of knew that if you don't do it on these two levels, even like the Orthodox who are just good at or better at being more observant, they're going to fall into the habit of just the ritual aspect of it and not the feeling of it? Like it's easy to fall into habit. That's why they call it a habit. So you've got to be spiritual about each and every time you do it, or else.
Absolutely. That's everything. Not only, I mean, we will see as we follow him, we will see the extent of this, how far he takes this. It's not just when you're doing a mitzvah. We're not really deep into his theology yet, but in the Baal Shem's telling, every person is created out of divine material, and our entire purpose is to live every second with a full awareness of God's presence and the fact that we are part of God. It's not just when it's time for davening or it's time to make a bracha. Every moment we should be aware that that's really what we're about. And we'll see that especially as we get into his stuff about prayer, but it's in every dimension. That's a foundational principle of the Besht. Cliff and then Mickey. Cliff first.
So just real quick, it seems to me that this also reinforces the sense of communal study, or more than one person studying this, that individually you cannot decode this, that in fact, there in the first piece that you went through, there's a very clear sampling of the Baal Shem Tov saying, let's do this together as a group, because you can then see more deeper where I'm coming from and where this language is coming from in my mind. I don't know. It's just a thought.
Absolutely.
Of community.
Totally right. That's right. And that's why all of these Hasidic teachers, I mean, the Besht, well, I didn't share with you, and I probably should have done this, the Besht before, and I don't know if this part is historical or if this is part of like the kind of saintly literature about him that happens after his death. But part of his story is that before he becomes well known, he goes off and he spends time meditating in the Carpathian Mountains. And then he comes back, and then he begins to share it with his community. And all of the Hasidic teachers, and I mean, in some sense, it wouldn't be Judaism if it didn't happen in the context of community, right? We've never held out the person whose journey ends at a monastery. Many of our teachers, their journey begins in an isolated way of meditation. But if it ends there, then it's not really Jewish, but it can begin there. And that's Moses and Shimon Bar Yochai and, you know, everybody else. So yeah, the communal dimension is definitely essential. Mickey, go ahead.
I just think that this idea that there are two levels of mitzvot, and if you don't have the right kavanah, the right neshama,
Yeah.
you're not connecting with God. To me, I mean, that's fine for some people, for people who study and who delve into these things. And I'm really thinking of my father, who was not a learned man at all. He didn't study Torah. He didn't study, but he was very, very careful. The joke in the family was he read through on Pesach. He would read through every word in Haggadah. It would be impossible for anyone to think or consider it. He did all the mitzvot. He put on the tefillin in the morning. He did the brachos, and even though he didn't, I don't think, had any thought of the ethereal, all of this really did connect him to God.
Right.
I don't think it was never meaningless for him, even though to the people around him, it appeared to be meaningless.
Right. I
So,
hear you. Yeah.
You know, I think
You're saying
it's just fine.
You're saying there's a way of being aware of God and having meaning and power without it being some like mystical experience where you feel like you're cleaving to God. I hear you, and I affirm that. And but you know, this is the language of the Besht.
Right.
That, you know, he takes us to very, very deep places through a theology that tries to see that we're constantly striving to cleave to God, and that's the truest level of reality. But yeah, it's not for everybody. Although the Baal Shem Tovs would have thought it did think it was for everybody.
Right. That's the elitism that you referred to before, I think.
Right. That I would say that's half of it. Yeah, that's part of it. But again, there is this countervailing force. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do one more teaching. That is a little more focused on this week's Torah portion, which is Bereshit. And then what we're going to do is, then I'll talk about where we're going next, okay? Because we're going in a slightly different direction. Okay, I'm going to read this because I want to take us through it somewhat quickly, but there's a lot to explain. Okay, so this is from Toldot Yaakov Yosef. So this is through Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, so who was, you know, one of the first students, first or second student of the Besht. The enlightened one will contemplate, and the wise one will know. And that's just like this introductory phrase that happens a lot. But what I wanted to point out, just because it's so cool, is that phrase, if you look at it in the Hebrew, it begins with the letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. And some of these Kabbalistic teachers are doing that kind of stuff all the time. Just as like putting a beautiful bow on their teaching. Okay, so he says this. I'm going to say these are the Baal Shem, I'm going to say the Besht says, but technically it's actually the words of the Yaakov Yosef, okay? So these verses of creation at the beginning of the Torah are addressed in the Talmud. And as I write elsewhere, this can be explained in light of the Tikkunim. Tikkunim is a specific passage of the Zohar that deals with creation, where it talks, and in the Tikkunim it quotes Malachi, I, Hashem, do not change, lo shaniti. God says, I do not change. But I do, that is God speaking, I do become concealed in many garments and many coverings and many husks. Right, a husk meaning the outer part, the seed is inside, but the husk is outside. These things, that is the concealed, the garments, these are tohu vavohu and darkness. And this is what we mean when we say, I will hide my face from them. Okay, so let's pause here for a moment. because there's so many different ideas going on in this. So the Kabbalists, one of the things the Kabbalists are doing, or I guess one of the ways to look at what the Kabbalists are doing, is that they are looking at the Torah. And the Torah has all these stories of God said this, God got angry, then God changed his mind, God regretted, da 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 da. God left, God came back. And the Kabbalists are saying, no, no, God is total perfection, unchanging unity. God is the only thing that doesn't change. There's just pure isness for always and forever, unchanging. However, there are different extents to which God is concealed, and the reality of God is not apparent to us. So what changes is our ability to see God's oneness in the world. But God's oneness never, ever changes. God is always there. So when we're freaking out at the chaos of the world, it's because we're not seeing the oneness that is certainly there, necessarily there, always there. It is being concealed. That's why it looks like God changes. So the Baal Shem Tov connects that to tohu vavohu, which is, sorry, I probably should have put this in here, chaos and void, as the most translations of Genesis have it, that have that phrase. So when the Torah says that the earth, that the world was tohu vavohu, chaos and void, and then God starts to create, we still encounter that tohu vavohu in a world that seems overcome by darkness and broken and meaningless and fracturedness and doubt and pain and agony and confusion. That is still the process of creation playing out. God seeking to reveal and conceal different levels of creation. That chaos and void is still part of our lives. And this is what it means when God says to Moses, I will hide my face from them. So God later in Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, God says to Moses, when the Jewish people abandon me, which they certainly will, I will hide my face from them. God isn't changing. God isn't leaving. God isn't abandoning, according to the Kabbalists, according to the Baal Shem Tov. God always is. It's a question of whether God will be covered up or not covered up. So now let's talk about why this teaching matters. There are many garments and coverings within which the Holy One is concealed. As I write, probably I should have put elsewhere, I heard from my teacher, that means the Baal Shem Tov, that if one knows that the Holy One is hidden in a place, then he is not hidden, and all evildoers are scattered, like all suffering, all badness is scattered. This is the meaning of I will surely hide my face from them. He will hide from them so that they will not know that the Holy One is there in a concealed way. But once a person knows this great principle, then there is no barrier between a person and God during the time of Torah. And even in prayer, when a person has distracting thoughts, literally foreign thoughts, which is a phrase you hear a lot in Jewish spiritual writing, these are garments and concealments within which the Holy One is hidden. Once a person knows that the Holy One is hidden there, then God is not hidden, as I've written. So we're not going to read the rest of it because it's too far out and we don't have time for it. But does that make sense? Raise your hand if you're not hearing it or not really getting it. If you're not, it's fine, but let's just talk about it. Okay, so there's so much that's important in this teaching because you have the basic Kabbalistic idea. And I chose this because says so much about the Baal Shem Tov. There's the essential Kabbalistic idea of God's perfect unity that is there at all times. But the Baal Shem Tov gives us a personal language in order to articulate our own relationship to the divine reality that the Kabbalah talks about, right? And I know that for all of us who studied the gates of light, like I did my best to try to decode some of these concepts and to make them meaningful in our lives. but it's not a project of Jikatilia so much to talk about the experience of living in the face of anxiety and darkness and absence. He's not, and there's fascinating historical reasons for this or spiritual reasons, but his project is not the individual psychological experience of the religious person. The Baal Shem Tov gives us a vocabulary for talking about the Kabbalah through the lens of our personal experience. So you start with the Kabbalistic concept that that God's perfection is constant and always there. God is always there. God's oneness is always there, and it is unchanging. Then you say, also a Kabbalistic concept, that divine light is concealed, right? So that should be familiar Kabbalistic language. As you go from Keter down to Malchut, we can view that as a series of concealments of the divine light. But then the Baal Shem Tov talks about, so what do you do with that? Well, as soon as you are aware of that, if you can make yourself remember that, if you can raise your consciousness to say that the fear of God's absence, or the fear of standing in the face of meaninglessness or suffering, does not mean that the meaninglessness is real. It means you're experiencing that. And that what you're remembering is, even in this meaninglessness, even in this emptiness, even in this void, God is still there, but just concealed. Then God is there. As soon as you have that realization, then God is no longer hidden. Because as soon as you have that realization, it's as though you're manifesting the reality of God by God being observable to you. It's almost like some kind of like weird, I'm sure there's some quantum physics analogy here, but by God being observable to you, you're reifying God. And that therefore, now there's nothing to be worried about. So I think that you can see two things. First of all, the way in which this is a new language for Jewish mysticism that didn't exist before, which you can tell just from studying what you studied with me. But also, I hope that you can see the deep, profound power that this teaching has in helping us to confront those confusing dimensions of our own experience and the painful experience of not seeing a wholeness in the world. And reminding ourselves that in the face of fracturedness, there actually is wholeness that's just concealed, I think is an enormously important and life-giving spiritual tool. So let me pause there and see if there are comments or questions on this, and then I'm just going to set up what we're doing for next time. Joel.
Sound very easy.
Oh, Joel and then Ann.
Sorry, Joel.
Hi. So I guess I have the question of presuming that you believe in God. The idea that he is hiding himself, or that he's there, but he's hiding himself, so he's there. The bottom line is he ain't there. He's hiding himself from you. So how much better, again, as long as you believe that there's a God, how much better is it that, well, we take it as a given, there's a God, you can't see him, he's hidden, or he's not there.
Right.
I don't know if I see, it's like semantics. I don't know if I see the difference.
Right.
Now, for somebody who, and this is where I kind of take it, where, after the Holocaust, whatever, you just don't see God. So you start to believe there is no God. Then this makes me feel better to say, well, it's not that there is no God because you can't see it, or he's just hidden himself. And once you know that he's hidden himself, then he's still there.
Right.
But I'm presuming for a lot of people, or for the Jewish people, there's a certain basic belief by the Baal Shem Tov, whatever, that there is a God. I don't know if I get anything out of this.
I hear you. No, I think that's a fabulous question. And for sure, there's inescapably, there is an element of emuna, of faith that is inescapable from this, right? There's never going to be any, from whether it's from the Baal Shem Tov or anybody else, there's never going to be anything that, you know, is proof that you can take to the bank that's going to make you believe in God. You know, and it's not for want of trying. A lot of theologians have
But that's what I want.
that's what we all want. But here's the depth of the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that hidden within this is a profound teaching about Kabbalah. And this is, by the way, this is not going to be a satisfactory answer to you. I'm just sharing a reflection. Remember that Israel, or that people, humanity, are in the sphere of Malchut. We are in the sphere of Malchut, right? The lowest, most highly concealed level. But when we say God appears hidden, but God is not hidden, what that is Malchut itself awakening. So that's what the Baal Shem Tov means. And I don't know if I have the vocabulary to articulate this. That is what the Baal Shem Tov means when he says, by realizing God is hidden, God is no longer hidden. Because by a human being saying that and recognizing it, it makes it real. Because the human being is just a lower branch of the divine tree. So it means that the divine manifests in the human thought, God is here. So that's one thing. It's Malchut becoming conscious of itself. But another thing is, and I, you know, here I wonder whether we could even say that this applies outside of the world of theology, is if we substitute the word hope for God, okay, which I'm not saying is a no-brainer, okay, I'm not saying that's not problematic. But if we see God as like an ordering of the world that infuses the world with hope, right? If we get to a place of darkness and we say, and you know, anybody who's suffered extraordinary trauma, or anybody who's been in the throes of addiction, or anybody who's just faced the darkest darkness, has had these moments where if you say there is no hope, it's all over, then that is true. That is true. If you say I give up, then it is true. There is no hope in that place. But if you say, and if you can feel, I guess it's not just saying, you know what, I know that it's insanely dark, but this can't be all that there is. There must be some hope. I'm imagining right now that I'm going to get up from this darkness and I'm going to take a step forward, and that will at least get me through to the other day where there's more hope, and then maybe from there I can build. As soon as you said that, now hope really is real. It really is there. So I think that the Baal Shem Tov is also saying something not just Kabbalistic, but psychological, that as soon as you say God is here, God is there, because now there's the possibility of the darkness of dissolving in the presence of whatever the person decides to do with that. So I just want to offer that thought. Ann Prawl, and then we're going to move on.
No, I'm just going to sit with it.
Okay. Okay, so I wanted to make sure to at least get to that one teaching about the parasha, because what we did is we started with a historical setup for the Baal Shem Tov, which we're now done with, no more history. Then I looked at a couple of general teachings to introduce you to the way of thinking of the Baal Shem Tov. Then we looked at a teaching on Parshat Bereshit, because that's the parsha that we have today. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go to Parshat Noach for the next class, which is actually will be after Parshat Noach. But the reason we're doing that is within his, let's see, let me illustrate it like this. Okay, so here's the Baal Shem Tov on the Torah. And this book, they've just arranged all of his different teachings through his students, Torah portion by Torah portion. It goes through the whole Torah. This is volume 1. So it goes through the whole Torah, parsha by parsha. But it just so happens that within the second Torah portion of the Torah, which is Noach, the Baal Shem Tov goes on this very long tangent about the nature of prayer. And those teachings are known as Amud HaTefillah, the pillar of prayer. And there is a book called The Pillar of Prayer. I don't know if this is the only translation, but this is an excellent, heavily footnoted translation with an introduction to the Baal Shem Tov. Let's see here. It is a very unusual, very, very small publishing house. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to put this in the chat room. But it's a translation by Menachem Kallus, Kallus. And the publishing house is, I think, called Fons Vitae. But I'll put all the info in the chat room in just one moment. And you do not have to buy the book, but it will certainly make life more interesting for you. And give me 1 second, and then you can copy this. Translated by Menachem Kallus. Again, I'm not really positive of the publishing house, but it does look like what I said. Yeah. Fons Vitae Pub. Okay, so it's in the chat room now, so you should be able to copy that and then hopefully find it online. Logistical questions or other questions? Lenny, go ahead.
Please.
What was that book, the Chassidim and New History? Is that is that worth purchasing? I have it on the Kindle.
Sure. But hold on, before I give you that, I just found a link to the publishing house. So now I just saved you a step. I just put the link into the chat room. If you click on that link, it'll take you to the publisher itself. It looks like it's $25. Whether you could find it cheaper elsewhere, I don't know, but that's the book you're looking for. It's beautifully printed, by the way, and it's got incredibly great footnotes. It's really superb. Okay, so now to Lenny's question. Yes, I'm not going to be drawing on this book. It is ginormous, but it's excellent if you want a historical background to Hasidism. This is not a collection of spiritual teachings. This is like academic history of European Jewry in the 17th, 18th century and beyond. But let's see. If you look up, I'll put some info in here so you can look that up as well if you want it. Hasidism by David Biale et al. There's many other teachers, but I give you one just so you can start with it. Hasidism, it's called Hasidism, A New History. That's all I got. And so next time we're just going to dive into Amud HaTefillah, the pillar of prayer, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that. Yeah, go ahead, Joel.
I'm confused. So the book, we're mentioning so many different books. The book that has his teachings by Parsha, are you recommending that, or that's that's too academic and
no?
My
okay,
brain
yes,
skills?
So the only one I'm saying you really would be great to have for this class is this one.
Is that one?
That's really the only one I'm saying it would be great to have this. I promise you that this will not be like the Gates of Light translation in English. I'm not saying it's simple, but it's going to be way more meaningful to you. I promise you, just because of the nature of what the Baal Shem Tov was doing. So that's the only book you really ought to have. This one, the Parsha one is, this one is all in Hebrew. I'm sure they've translated this in English. I don't know what it is. So that's just optional. And if you're interested, I can try to track down Baal Shem Tov on the Parsha in English. And then Lenny was just asking about this history book, which David Stern was kind enough to give to me, which is excellent, but I'm not going to draw on this for the class.
By the way, I also took out of the library Stephen Hawkins, for dummies. I think I kept it out for I kept renewing it, and I'm still a dummy.
I
It
know.
was just,
Well, right. Well, yeah.
I just couldn't get it.
I didn't even. I was too afraid to even read that book because I didn't want to be too dumb for the dummies book. I was talking about the one that I don't remember what it was called, but it was printed in probably 1995 or something, and it was.
It's his most famous book. I mean, he actually has a book. It wasn't called whatever.
A brief history. Yeah. A brief history of time. That's what it was. But I think there is a brief history of time for dummies, but I'm afraid to read that because if I don't even understand that, then there's really no hope.
It was just that thing with time. I kept looking at this. I don't think I got past the first chapter. I just couldn't.
I know.
Frustrated the heck out of me.
Yeah.
I just want to check. Our next class for this is in 2 weeks. We're staying on a 2-week schedule.
Yep, that's right. I think that, well, in general, yes. Let me just make sure there's not something else interfering with that. Well, Cheryl, do you get the emails, this congregational emails?
Yes.
Yeah, so if you look in there, just scroll down, it'll have the dates of the next class.
Okay.
But yes, I'm pretty sure it's in 2 weeks. Okay, I'm excited. I really think that the pillar of prayer, we're going to spend some time on this, and I think it's going to be I hope it's going to be profound and meaningful and useful to you as you think about prayer. Some of the ideas are very, 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 very high and hard to grasp, and others are just very simply beautiful. And I think it'll be practical and interesting to you in your Jewish lives. Okay, have a great day. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yasha Koach.